The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Pine Street as 16-year-old Ashley drove home from her volunteer shift at the local animal shelter. She'd just finished helping with a successful adoption event, and her heart felt light. Her mom had taught her to drive extra carefully in this part of town, always following traffic rules to the letter. That's why she was surprised when red and blue lights started flashing in her rearview mirror. Ashley checked her speedometer. She was going exactly the speed limit. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled over, just like her parents had taught her. The police cruiser stopped behind her, and she could see the officer taking his time, making her wait. She did everything by the book, turned off the engine, placed her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, and tried to stay calm. Officer Richards approached her window. He was a tall man with cold eyes and a permanently stern expression that had earned him quite a reputation in the neighborhood. Ashley had heard stories about him at school, none of them good, but she'd always tried to give people the benefit of the doubt. "License and registration," he barked, not even bothering with a greeting. Ashley reached slowly for her documents, narrating her movements just as her parents had practiced with her countless times. The officer snatched the papers from her hands, studying them with exaggerated scrutiny. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered suddenly. Ashley's heart started racing. She knew her rights. There was no reason for her to exit the car for a simple traffic stop. Her voice shook slightly as she gathered her courage. "Sir, may I ask why?" "I was following all traffic rules," she said politely, trying to keep her voice steady. Her phone was recording in her lap, another safety measure her parents had insisted on. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Officer Richards yanked her car door open, his face twisted with anger. "I said, step out," he shouted, grabbing her arm. Ashley's phone clattered to the floor, still recording. At the police station, things went from bad to worse. Officer Richards cited a suspicious behavior charge, a vague accusation that Ashley knew was completely baseless. But it was what happened in the holding area that would soon shock the entire nation. Ashley sat alone in the cold room, her School Honors Society pin still attached to her sweater. Officer Richards returned with a pair of scissors, claiming he needed to check for hidden substances in her hair. Ashley's beautiful natural hair, which she'd been growing and caring for since elementary school, had become her signature. She'd just performed with it styled elaborately at last week's school dance showcase. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "My hair isn't hiding anything. You can see that." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. In the next few minutes, as another officer watched silently from the doorway, Richards destroyed years of growth and care, leaving Ashley's hair in uneven patches. What Officer Richards didn't know was that a young woman in the next holding cell had captured part of the incident through the window, horrified by what she was witnessing. As Ashley sat there, shoulders shaking with silent sobs, this stranger was already sending the footage to her lawyer. Ashley's parents, both respected civil rights lawyers who had dedicated their lives to fighting injustice, were frantically trying to locate their daughter. When they finally arrived at the station hours later, the sight of their beloved child, traumatized and shorn, would become the catalyst for a case that would change everything. That evening, as Ashley curled up in her mother's arms at home, the video was already beginning to circulate online. Her father, fighting back tears of rage and sorrow, made a sullen promise. "This time, they went too far. This time, we're going to make sure justice is served." Little did Officer Richards know that his impulsive act of cruelty would not only end his career, but would spark a movement that would reshape police accountability across the nation. As Ashley finally drifted off to sleep that night, exhausted from crying, the first tweets with #JusticeForAshley were already gaining traction, setting in motion a chain of events that would rock the very foundation of law enforcement in their city. The video spread like wildfire through social media that night. People couldn't believe what they were seeing. A teenage girl, an honors student, having her hair forcibly cut by a police officer. By sunrise, Ashley's story had reached far beyond their quiet suburban community. Ashley's mother stood in the kitchen the next morning, her hands shaking as she tried to make breakfast. The house phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. Her father sat at the dining table, laptop open, dark circles under his eyes from a sleepless night spent documenting everything and fielding calls from other civil rights attorneys. Upstairs, Ashley stood in front of her bathroom mirror, running her fingers over the uneven patches where her beautiful hair had once been. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends and classmates, but she couldn't bring herself to read them yet. The memory of Officer Richards' cold eyes and the sound of those scissors still felt too raw. "Honey," her mother's gentle voice came from the doorway. "Your breakfast is ready. You don't have to go to school today if you're not feeling up to it." Ashley caught her mother's reflection in the mirror, saw the mix of love and fury in her eyes. They both knew this wasn't just about hair, it was about dignity, respect, and basic human rights. But Ashley surprised them both. "I want to go," she said quietly, straightening her shoulders. "I won't let him make me hide." Her mother helped her arrange a scarf around her head, their eyes meeting in the mirror with shared determination. The scene at Riverside High School that morning was unlike anything anyone had expected. As Ashley walked toward the entrance, her best friend ran out to meet her. Behind her came dozens of other students, girls and boys of all backgrounds, their heads wrapped in colorful scarves in solidarity. Someone had organized it through social media overnight. The school principal, who had already seen the viral video, called an immediate assembly. Instead of the usual morning announcements, she spoke about dignity, respect, and standing up against injustice. When Ashley walked into the auditorium, the entire student body rose in a standing ovation. Meanwhile, at the police station, things were reaching a boiling point. The video had forced the department to address what happened. Officer Richards arrived for his shift to find himself placed on immediate administrative leave. His fellow officers, many of whom had turned a blind eye to his behavior for years, now couldn't avoid the spotlight his actions had brought to the department. Local news vans lined the street outside the station. The police chief called an emergency press conference, but his rehearsed statements about investigating the incident fell flat. The reporters' questions were relentless. How could this happen? Where were the supervisors? What about Officer Richards' previous complaints? By afternoon, more witnesses from the station began coming forward. A janitor who had seen similar incidents but feared speaking up. A desk sergeant who had filed complaints that were ignored. The wall of silence was crumbling, and with it, years of overlooked misconduct were coming to light. Ashley's parents' law office became a command center for action. Other families started calling, sharing similar stories of encounters with Officer Richards. A pattern emerged. He had been targeting young people of color for years, but complaints had been buried in bureaucratic red tape. That evening, as community leaders gathered in their living room to plan next steps, Ashley sat on the stairs listening. She heard words like lawsuit, civil rights violation, and department-wide reform. But what touched her most was hearing how her story had given others the courage to speak up. Her phone buzzed with a text from her best friend. "Turn on the news." The local station was showing footage of a spontaneous gathering downtown. Hundreds of people had shown up, many wearing scarves, holding signs that read "Justice for Ashley" and "End Police Brutality." The crowd was diverse: parents, students, teachers, and even some off-duty police officers who felt compelled to take a stand. As night fell, Ashley stood in her bedroom window, watching more news vans park along their street. Her father had already scheduled meetings with state officials for the next day. Her mother was organizing a community meeting at the local church. Something big was starting, and somehow her traumatic experience had become a catalyst for change. Before going to bed, Ashley opened her social media for the first time since everything happened. Among thousands of messages of support, she found one that brought tears to her eyes. A young girl from across the country had posted, "Because of you, I'm not afraid to speak up anymore. Thank you for being brave." Ashley touched her scarf gently, remembering her long hair, but feeling something new growing in its place, not just hair, but strength, purpose, and the knowledge that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the most important changes. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, but she was ready to face them. Her story was far from over. By the third day after the incident, the movement had grown beyond anything anyone could have predicted. The morning started with a sea of people gathering outside Riverside Police Department, their voices rising in unified calls for justice. Among them was Mrs. Chen, Ashley's elderly neighbor who had never attended a protest in her life, holding a handmade sign that read "Protect Our Children." The crowd was remarkable in its diversity. Teachers stood shoulder to shoulder with store owners. The local barber had closed his shop to be there, bringing dozens of his customers with him. Even some retired police officers joined the demonstration, saying this incident had crossed a line they couldn't ignore. Inside her home, Ashley watched the coverage on TV, still amazed by how her personal tragedy had touched so many hearts. Her phone buzzed with a notification. A famous R&B singer had posted about her story, sharing her own experiences with hair discrimination. Within hours, celebrities and influencers across the country began sharing similar stories, turning #JusticeForAshley into a nationwide conversation about respect, dignity, and abuse of power. At Riverside High, students had organized their own peaceful protest. The school administration, instead of trying to shut it down, provided space in the gymnasium for students to make posters and share their experiences. Ashley's classmates had started a petition that already had over 50,000 signatures, demanding not just accountability for Officer Richards, but comprehensive reform of police training and oversight. Local businesses showed their support in creative ways. The beauty supply store announced they would donate hair care products to young people affected by discrimination. The neighborhood coffee shop changed its name on their sign to Justice Brew for the Week, donating profits to legal defense funds. Even the usually quiet library put up a powerful display about civil rights history, featuring stories of resistance and change. The police chief called another press conference, this time with a different tone. Faced with mounting evidence and community pressure, he announced a full investigation into not just Officer Richards, but the entire department's handling of civilian complaints. "We serve the community," he stated, his voice carrying real emotion, "and we failed to live up to that duty." That afternoon, Ashley received an unexpected visitor, the young woman who had recorded the video from the holding cell. She had come forward publicly, despite her initial fears, to share her complete testimony. The two hugged, both crying, understanding how a single act of witnessing could spark such significant change. Community leaders organized a town hall meeting at the local community center. The turnout was so large they had to set up speakers outside for the overflow crowd. People lined up to share their stories, not just about Officer Richards, but about years of similar incidents that had gone unreported out of fear or hopelessness. Each story strengthened their collective resolve for change. Ashley's parents worked tirelessly, coordinating with civil rights organizations and other attorneys, but they also made sure to take breaks to support their daughter. That evening, they sat together in their backyard, sharing a quiet moment. Ashley's father gently adjusted her scarf, which had become a symbol of resistance. "You know what makes me proudest?" he said softly. "Not just your courage, but how you've inspired others to be courageous too." Online, support continued to pour in. Artists created powerful digital illustrations of Ashley's story. Teachers across the country used the incident to discuss civil rights with their students. A group of film students asked permission to document the community's response for a project about grassroots activism. The local news interviewed Ashley's science teacher, who spoke about her brilliant mind and kind heart. "This isn't just about what was taken from her," the teacher said, fighting back tears. "It's about what she's given all of us, the strength to stand up and say no more." As night fell, hundreds gathered for a candlelight vigil in the town square. The flames flickered in the darkness as people shared songs, poems, and prayers. Ashley stood with her parents, surrounded by love and support, watching as strangers became allies and a community found its voice. Before going to sleep that night, Ashley wrote in her journal, "Someone once told me that change happens when pain meets purpose. I never understood what that meant until now. My hair will grow back, but something else has grown too, hope, and hope, when it spreads through a community, becomes unstoppable." The movement was gaining momentum, and tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. But for now, Ashley felt something she hadn't expected to feel so soon after her trauma: pride. Not just in herself, but in her community, in the power of unity, and in the possibility of real change. The internal investigation at Riverside Police Department started early on a Monday morning. The newly appointed investigator, a veteran officer with 30 years of experience, sat at her desk reviewing Officer Richards' personnel file. What she found made her stomach turn: dozens of civilian complaints buried under layers of bureaucratic paperwork, each one dismissed or marked inconclusive without proper investigation. Meanwhile, Ashley had returned to school, her head still wrapped in a scarf that had become a symbol of resistance. As she walked through the halls, she noticed something different. Teachers who had once stayed silent about difficult topics were now leading discussions about civil rights in their classrooms. The school principal had even invited civil rights speakers to address the student body. Back at the police station, more officers began coming forward. A young rookie revealed how Officer Richards had bragged about putting people in their place. A desk sergeant admitted to witnessing multiple incidents of misconduct but staying quiet out of fear of retaliation. The wall of silence that had protected bad behavior for years was finally crumbling. The investigation took an unexpected turn when the IT department discovered that Officer Richards had deliberately disabled his body camera multiple times during arrests. But what he didn't know was that the backup system had captured everything. The footage revealed a disturbing pattern of behavior that went far beyond Ashley's incident. Ashley's parents received a call from the district attorney's office. The prosecutor, a normally reserved woman, could barely contain her anger as she described the evidence they'd uncovered. "This isn't just about one incident," she explained. "We're looking at years of systematic abuse of power." That afternoon, local news crews gathered outside the police station as boxes of documents were carried out, years of buried complaints finally seeing the light of day. The sight reminded everyone of scenes from old movies about corruption investigations, but this was real, happening in their own community. Inside the station, the atmosphere was tense but hopeful. Many officers, especially the younger ones, expressed relief that the truth was finally coming out. "This is why I became a police officer," one young officer told the investigators. "To protect people, not to abuse power." The police chief called an all-hands meeting. The usual polished speeches were replaced by raw honesty. "We've failed our community," he admitted, his voice heavy with emotion. "But more importantly, we've failed ourselves by allowing this behavior to continue. That changes today." Ashley attended a community oversight meeting with her parents. As she listened to the proposed changes, mandatory bias training, civilian review boards, transparent complaint procedures, she realized that her traumatic experience might actually lead to lasting change. A retired police officer approached her after the meeting, tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. "You've helped us remember why we took this job in the first place." The investigation revealed something else unexpected. Officer Richards had targeted other young people before, but many families had been too afraid to come forward. Now, encouraged by Ashley's courage, they began sharing their stories. Each new revelation strengthened the case for reform. At school, Ashley's history teacher used the ongoing investigation as a real-world example of checks and balances in action. Students learned how civilian oversight of police departments had evolved over the years and how communities could work together to create positive change. 1 month into the investigation, the evidence was overwhelming. Officer Richards hadn't just violated department policy, he'd broken the law repeatedly. The investigation team presented their findings to the police commission in a public hearing that lasted nearly 6 hours. Community members packed the room, listening intently as years of misconduct were finally exposed. That evening, Ashley sat with her parents watching the news coverage. The reporter stood outside the police station, describing how the investigation had expanded beyond one officer to examine the entire system that had protected him. Ashley touched her growing hair, remembering the fear and humiliation she'd felt that day. But now, those feelings were mixed with something else, the satisfaction of knowing that her courage had helped expose the truth. The investigation wasn't just about punishing one officer anymore. It had become a catalyst for rebuilding trust between the police and the community they served. New policies were being drafted, training programs redesigned, and most importantly, a culture of accountability was taking root. As Ashley finished her homework that night, she glanced at the framed newspaper article on her wall, "Teens' Courage Sparks Police Reform." The investigation wasn't over yet, but already things were changing. Her father had told her that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of courage. Looking back, she realized that standing up for herself had given others the courage to stand up too. The next day would bring more revelations, more changes, and more challenges. But for now, Ashley felt at peace knowing that the truth was finally coming to light and real change was happening. Her story had opened a door that couldn't be closed again. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters on the morning of the first hearing. Ashley walked beside her parents, her head held high, wearing a beautiful head wrap that her grandmother had sent her. The fabric was decorated with patterns representing strength and wisdom, perfect for this day. Inside the courtroom, Officer Richards sat at the defendant's table, looking smaller somehow in his civilian clothes. His arrogance had faded, replaced by the nervous glances of someone who finally realized the seriousness of his actions. The district attorney had filed multiple charges against him, including civil rights violations and abuse of power. As Ashley took her seat in the courtroom, she felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. Turning around, she saw the face of another young girl who had come forward during the investigation. They shared a quiet look of understanding, both knowing the courage it took to be there. Throughout the room, other families who had suffered similar experiences sat ready to testify. The proceedings began with opening statements. The prosecutor stood before the jury, her voice clear and determined. She didn't just talk about laws and violations. She talked about trust, about the sacred duty police officers have to protect their community, and about how Officer Richards had betrayed that trust repeatedly over the years. During the breaks between sessions, Ashley noticed something interesting in the hallways. Several police officers who had come to watch the trial were having quiet conversations with community members, sharing their own feelings about the need for change. One veteran officer even apologized to her personally, tears in his eyes, saying, "This isn't what we stand for." Evidence presented in court painted a clear picture. The prosecution showed the viral video, body camera footage from other incidents, and a pattern of complaints that had been ignored. But what really moved the jury were the testimonies, honest, raw stories from people who had encountered Officer Richards over the years. Ashley's testimony came on the third day. As she sat in the witness stand, she didn't see Officer Richards. Instead, she looked at the jury and told her story simply and truthfully. She talked about her volunteer work at the animal shelter, her dreams of becoming a doctor, and how one man's abuse of power had tried to strip away her dignity that day. The defense tried to justify Officer Richards' actions, claiming he was following procedures. But their arguments fell flat when faced with the evidence and testimony. Even some of his fellow officers testified against him, breaking the traditional blue wall of silence because they believed it was the right thing to do. During lunch breaks, the courthouse cafeteria became an unexpected place of healing. Families who had been afraid to speak up for years shared their stories with each other. Community leaders and police reform advocates discussed ways to prevent similar incidents in the future. Even some of the courthouse staff shared their own experiences with law enforcement. As the trial progressed, more media attention focused on the broader implications. News outlets discussed how this case could set precedents for police accountability nationwide. Legal experts appeared on TV explaining how this trial could change the way police departments handle misconduct cases. One particularly moving moment came when Ashley's art teacher testified about a project Ashley had created after the incident, a self-portrait surrounded by words like dignity, justice, and change. The artwork had been displayed in the school hallway, inspiring other students to express their own experiences through art. The defense's case began to crumble when they tried to question Ashley's character. Her pristine school record, volunteer work, and the overwhelming support from her teachers and community painted a picture that couldn't be denied. Even the judge seemed moved by the positive impact she had made in her community despite her trauma. Outside the courthouse, supporters gathered daily, holding signs and sharing stories. Local food trucks started showing up to provide free meals to the families attending the trial. A group of law students sat in on the proceedings every day, taking notes and discussing how this case could influence their future careers in justice reform. As the trial neared its end, Ashley found herself thinking about all the changes that had already happened. Her school had started a student advocacy group. The police department had implemented new training programs. Community oversight boards were being established. Whatever the verdict, she knew things would never go back to how they were before. On the final day of testimony, Officer Richards' former partner took the stand. His testimony was devastating. Years of witnessed misconduct finally brought to light. The officer spoke about his own regret at not speaking up sooner and how this case had made him realize the importance of doing what's right, even when it's difficult. That evening, as Ashley did her homework at the kitchen table, she overheard her parents discussing the trial with other civil rights attorneys. They talked about how this case could help change police training nationwide, how it might prevent other families from experiencing similar trauma. Ashley smiled quietly to herself, knowing that sometimes the worst moments in life can lead to the most important changes. The trial was nearing its end, but its impact was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments, and soon after, a verdict that could change everything. Ashley touched her growing hair, feeling stronger than ever, ready to face whatever came next. The morning of the verdict, the city seemed to hold its breath. News helicopters circled overhead as crowds gathered outside the courthouse. Ashley's mom made her favorite breakfast, but neither of them could eat much. The weight of this moment felt heavy on everyone's shoulders. Inside the packed courtroom, Ashley sat between her parents, their hands linked tightly together. Her school friends had asked to come support her, but the judge had limited attendance due to space. Still, she knew they were all watching the live news coverage from their classrooms, waiting just like her. The jury had deliberated for 3 days. 3 days of endless speculation on TV, 3 days of community prayer vigils, 3 days of Ashley trying to focus on her homework while her phone buzzed constantly with supportive messages. Now, finally, they would hear the decision. When the jury filed in, Ashley studied their faces, trying to read their expressions. They looked tired but determined. One juror, an elderly woman, caught Ashley's eye and gave her the smallest of nods. The courtroom fell completely silent as the judge asked if they had reached a verdict. The jury foreman stood, hands slightly shaking as she held the paper. In the matter of the state versus Officer Richards, on the count of civil rights violations, we find the defendant guilty. A collective gasp filled the room. On the count of abuse of power, we find the defendant guilty. Tears started flowing freely in the courtroom. On the count of assault, we find the defendant guilty. Officer Richards slumped in his chair as the verdicts were read. His defense attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but he shrugged it off. For the first time since this all began, he looked directly at Ashley, and she saw something she hadn't expected: shame. The judge called for order as murmurs swept through the courtroom. He spoke about the seriousness of the crimes, about betrayal of public trust, about the importance of accountability. Then came the sentence: 5 years in prison, permanent loss of his badge, and mandatory participation in community service programs after release. Outside, the crowd erupted in cheers as the news spread. Ashley's classmates, watching the live coverage at school, broke into spontaneous applause. The principal had to make an announcement reminding everyone to stay calm, even though she was smiling too. But the verdict wasn't the only victory that day. The police chief announced immediate reforms: mandatory body cameras that couldn't be disabled, civilian oversight committees with real power, and new training programs developed with community input. Ashley's case had become a turning point for the entire department. Later that afternoon, something unexpected happened. Several police officers approached Ashley and her family outside the courthouse. These weren't the same officers who had protected Richards. These were the ones who had testified against him, who had chosen truth over loyalty to a broken system. One officer stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "What happened to you was wrong," he said simply. "We wear these badges to protect people, not hurt them. Your courage in standing up, it's helping us remember that." He handed Ashley a small package. Inside was a framed copy of the Police Oath of Honor with a handwritten note: "Thank you for helping us live up to this." The civil suit was settled quickly after the criminal verdict. The compensation was substantial, but Ashley's parents had already decided every penny would go to a new foundation. They would help other young people stand up against abuse of power, provide legal support, and work with police departments willing to change. That evening, the local news interviewed Ashley on the courthouse steps. The reporter asked how she felt about the verdict. Ashley touched her hair, now growing back in beautiful spirals, and thought carefully before answering. "This isn't just about punishing one person," she said. "It's about making sure nobody else has to go through what I did. Change happens when we're brave enough to stand up for what's right." Back home, messages poured in from across the country. Other departments were looking at the reforms being implemented. Civil rights organizations wanted to work with Ashley's family's new foundation. Young people shared their own stories of standing up against injustice, inspired by her example. Ashley sat in her bedroom that night, looking at her reflection. Her hair was different now, shorter, but growing back stronger. Like her, it had been changed by what happened, but not defeated. On her desk lay college brochures. She was thinking about studying law now, inspired by how the legal system could be used to protect people's rights. 1 year later, Ashley stood in front of her mirror, running her fingers through her natural hair that had grown back in beautiful coils. She was getting ready for a special ceremony at City Hall, where she would speak about the changes her story had helped create. Her mom called from downstairs, saying they needed to leave soon, but Ashley took one more moment to reflect on everything that had happened. The police department had transformed over the past year. The new training programs, which Ashley had helped design, were showing real results. Officers now received extensive education about cultural sensitivity, implicit bias, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity. The Civilian Oversight Board, which included community members of all backgrounds, had real power to investigate complaints and recommend changes. At school, things were different too. Ashley's experience had sparked conversations that needed to happen. The curriculum now included discussions about civil rights, community relations, and the power of speaking up against injustice. Students who had once been afraid to share their stories now felt empowered to talk about their experiences with authority figures. The foundation Ashley's family had started was thriving. They had already helped several other families stand up against abuse of power, providing legal support and advocacy training. More importantly, they worked with police departments across the country, showing them how positive change could happen when communities and law enforcement worked together. As Ashley arrived at City Hall, she saw familiar faces in the crowd. There was her former art teacher, who had turned Ashley's story into a powerful lesson about expression and resistance. The young woman who had recorded the original video was there too, now working as a community organizer. Even some of the officers who had testified against Officer Richards had come to show their support. The ceremony was about more than just acknowledging what had happened, it was about celebrating how far they'd come. The police chief spoke about the department's transformation, sharing statistics that showed dramatic improvements in community relations and officer conduct. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real change could be seen in the way officers and community members now greeted each other on the streets, the increased trust, the open dialogue. When it was Ashley's turn to speak, she didn't use the formal speech she'd prepared. Instead, she spoke from her heart about how one act of cruelty had sparked a movement for change. She talked about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's scary. But most importantly, she talked about hope, hope that comes from seeing people unite for positive change. After the ceremony, a young officer approached Ashley. She was part of the new recruitment class, trained under the reformed system. "Your story is part of our training now," she said. "They teach us about what happened to you as an example of what we're never supposed to be and how we can be better." She showed Ashley her badge, which now came with a new oath that emphasized protection, respect, and community service. Back at home that evening, Ashley helped her parents sort through letters they'd received at the foundation. There were messages from other cities wanting to implement similar reforms, stories from young people inspired to become civil rights lawyers, and even a letter from Officer Richards himself. He was still serving his sentence, but had written to express his remorse and thank Ashley for helping him understand the impact of his actions. Ashley's mom had organized a community dinner to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of the reforms. The local restaurant had donated food, and people from all walks of life gathered in the community center. There were police officers chatting with teenagers, community leaders sharing ideas with city officials, and families who had once been afraid of law enforcement now feeling comfortable enough to share their stories. During dinner, Ashley's former principal announced a new scholarship program named in her honor. It would support students who showed commitment to social justice and community service. Ashley felt overwhelmed with emotion as she realized how much positive change had come from her difficult experience. Later that night, as the celebrations wound down, Ashley sat in the community center's garden with her best friend. They talked about their plans for college. Ashley had decided to study law and public policy, wanting to continue the work of creating positive change. Her friend pointed to the stars and said, "You know, sometimes the darkest moments lead us to the brightest futures." Ashley smiled, touching her hair that had grown back even more beautiful than before. She thought about all the young people who would never have to go through what she did because of the changes that had been made. She thought about the police officers who would serve their communities with respect and dignity because of new training and accountability. Most of all, she thought about how one person's courage to stand up against injustice could create waves of positive change that would continue long into the future. As she headed home that night, Ashley passed the police station. The lights were on, and through the window, she could see new recruits in a training session. On the wall behind them hung a large photo, the moment when community members and police officers had joined hands during last year's reforms. Under it was a simple message: protect with respect, serve with dignity. Ashley's story had become more than just a headline or a viral video. It had become a catalyst for real change, a reminder that justice is possible when people stand together, and a promise to future generations that they would be protected, not persecuted, by those sworn to serve them.